All right. So the last section for us to talk about in our notes is about how we as humans are impacting the environment, impacting the earth. We'll talk about some general characteristics of humans, which makes us have a large impact on the earth. We'll talk about some of the specific environmental problems that humans have come about, some possible ways that we can reduce our impacts on the environment, things like that. So this is a part I really like this section because this is what I studied in college and in graduate school, and this is what I'm very interested in, environmentalism. So that's sort of what this topic is about. So a question we come up with, I mean, you all know that humans have huge impacts on the earth. But the question is why? There's lots of species on earth. Why is it humans that have such large impacts? And there's really two big factors. Humans have the ability to really make huge changes to the environment. Humans have this ability to alter our environment and basically transform any part of the earth into whatever really we choose to. If you think about the southwest of the United States, anyone ever been to Las Vegas? Okay. That's when you went to Red Rocks, Francesca? Okay, so Las Vegas, what's it like around the city of Las Vegas? Anybody know?
It's very dry.
Yeah, it is in the middle of the desert, right? In the middle of a desert, you would think is typically not a place where millions of people would live. What has allowed millions of people to live in the middle of the desert like Las Vegas? Why can we live there? Well, there's a couple reasons. One is water, right? So what makes a desert is a lack of moisture. And so we dammed the Colorado River. That's what the Hoover Dam is. And you have now Lake Mead, which is there. And you have the movement of water from different sources brought into the middle of the desert to give people water that they need to live. You have air conditioning, right? That it's really hot out there. And so typically you wouldn't find lots of people living there, but because we now have air conditioning and use large amounts of electricity to control the climate, we can have buildings that are, 68 degrees Fahrenheit in the middle of the desert, even in the summer, because we're using huge amounts of electricity to cool them down. So we can, because of mechanization, industrialization, energy production, we can basically transform any ecosystem we want into whatever ecosystem we choose it to be. So that's one important reason. Another is because of our population growth. You could really trace back most environmental problems to the sheer number of people living on the earth and the resources that those people use. We'll look at a graph here in a minute, but our population has been growing exponentially for the last several hundred years, a couple hundred years. And as humans, we use huge amounts of energy and resources that keep us living, support the lifestyle we choose to live. And so just like we talked about in other ecosystems, there's a carrying capacity, right? There's only a certain number of elk that can be supported in Yellowstone National Park. There's only a certain number of trout that can be supported in a stream. Well, there is a carrying capacity also for the earth in terms of humans, right? There's only a finite, limited amount of resources on the earth. If our population grows beyond that, well, then we have serious problems. Then there's not enough resources to support all of the people on the earth. And that's going to mean that some people don't have enough resources to live. It means that people will fight wars for those resources, that there could be famine or disease. So our population growth is another reason. Here's what it looks like. If you look at a graph of our population over the past several thousand years, our population was relatively low for a long period of time, growing, but pretty slowly. Okay. Until we get up here into, last couple hundred years. And then if you look at this graph, we see it just skyrocket here. So what happened? What caused this change? How, if our growth had just continued along this path, we'd have maybe 1 billion people on Earth today. But we don't. We have like 7 billion people. What changed? Anyone have any ideas about that? Probably studied it, I guess, in social studies.
Maybe with like the new technology and like we have vaccines that prevents people from dying from sickness.
Yeah, there's a couple of really important. There's several important things, but one, medical advances is a huge one, and Francesca named one of them: vaccines. Right, we now develop vaccines that can prevent the death and sickness of millions and millions of people. Diseases like smallpox or polio, which used to kill or have serious consequences for millions and millions of people, those diseases almost no longer exist because we've developed vaccines to prevent them. Antibiotics, right? Another advancement that's only in the last 100 years or so. Before that, there were no antibiotics. If somebody got an infection, a bacterial infection, then it ran its course. And sometimes that meant people got very sick or died from those infections. Today, we have antibiotics to help control that. We know about pathogens that spread disease. Okay? So medical advances have allowed people to live longer, have allowed more infants to survive into childhood, have allowed for sicknesses to be cured. So that's a huge reason for an increase in population. Another is agriculture. What we call the Green Revolution allowed humans to grow food more efficiently. And that provided better yields of crops and so forth to provide more food for more people, which allows for populations to grow. So those are some of the reasons. And again, as population grows, resource use grows, and that leads to many of these issues we're going to talk about. Because people require resources, right? We require basic resources, food, water, shelter, but we also use a lot of other resources that aren't actually necessities for life. So we call these things natural resources, and natural resources are just things that we depend on the earth for. When we think about resources, we often put them into two categories: renewable resources and non-renewable resources. Renewable resources are things that don't get used up over time, things that can be replenished at a rate at which they're used. So we could think about things like using wind power to generate electricity. That's something that's renewable, right? You don't use up the wind by putting up a wind turbine. Solar energy, right? The sun is shining. Us putting solar cells doesn't use up the sun's energy faster, right? It's basically an infinite source of energy that's replenished over time. Water, if treated properly, is a renewable resource. Food can be a renewable resource. Trees, lumber can be a renewable resource if it's used at a rate at which it's replenished over time. Other resources are non-renewable. They are basically finite. There's a limited amount on the earth, and as they are used up, they're gone. They're not going to be replaced in any manageable time span. Things like the fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas. These things were formed millions of years ago when huge swamps of vegetation were buried underground and compressed over millions and millions of years, forming these fuels. But they're not forming anymore. So if we dig some coal out of the earth and burn it, it's gone. It's not going to be replenished. Same thing with oil and natural gas. Minerals, metals that we take out of the earth, they're limited in supply. And so these non-renewable resources can be used up over time. If we look at just some examples, this is a wind farm, right? These are renewable sources of energy. Do you see these around here anywhere? You don't see wind turbines around our area? We actually live in a pretty decent place for wind energy, and you do see them. If you go drive to like Waterville, Madison County, Hamilton, Morrisville, those areas, if you drive down Route 20, you'll see off in the distance up on the ridge a bunch of wind turbines. It's an area that's very windy. They're up on the ridge, which often can be even windier than other areas. And so, yeah, that's us. As those blades of the turbine spin, they turn to a generator, which generates electricity. Hydropower. Hydropower is pretty prominent in New York State as well. By using the energy from moving water in a river, you can turn a turbine, which spins a generator, which makes electricity. And so we have hydropower. That's a renewable resource. Okay, that water is going to flow. The water doesn't get used up in the process. Photovoltaic cells, okay, solar energy. These solar cells take the sun's energy and directly transform it into electricity that we can use. Now, we don't live in the very best area for solar electricity. We can get some solar electricity, but because of our latitude, we don't get the most intense solar radiation. Some areas do. Geothermal energy is another one. You may not be familiar with geothermal energy. Uses energy from within the earth to obtain heat, which can create electricity or used to heat homes. But again, this isn't going to get used up. Here are some of the non-renewables. Coal, which has to be mined out of the ground and is burned to produce electricity or to power machinery and so forth for heating. Oil that's pumped out of the ground. Natural gas that's obtained from inside the earth as well. These are all forms of fossil fuels, right? All of these things were formed millions of years ago. And when they're taken out of the earth, they're used up. They also, when they're used, when they're combusted, produce significant amounts of pollution. If we think about these non-renewables, if you make electricity from wind power or hydroelectric power or solar power, there's no direct pollution released from those things. When we burn coal or oil or natural gas, there is. And so these non-renewable, besides being limited, also add to several of the environmental problems that we're going to be talking about. So we'll talk about a few of these different environmental issues: species extinction, water pollution, air pollution, atmospheric changes. I teach also AP Environmental Science, in which we spend basically the whole course talking about these different environmental issues and how humans cause them, how humans can address them. So if it's something you're interested in, something to think about for the future when you're like a senior taking AP Environmental Science. So let's talk about species extinction. So So if you probably know from maybe your science, there have been mass extinctions in the past, right? When the dinosaurs went extinct, that was a mass extinction. Okay. Millions of species became extinct in a relatively short period of geologic time. Humans are causing another mass extinction, however, now. And we're doing that in several ways. So, what causes a species to become extinct? Well, it could be directly hunting them. Right? We just talked about wolves. Wolves were not hunted to extinction, but other species have been. Okay? Passenger pigeons, for example. Passenger pigeons are used to be millions and millions in North America. They were hunted and they are now extinct. The dodo bird. Elephants are on the brink of extinction, okay, due to hunting. So we can actually directly go out and kill organisms and lead to extinction. But more often now, there are other ways that humans are causing extinctions. One is by pollution, including pesticides. Are you guys of the age where when you were in, did you talk about DDT back in elementary school? No, I thought that was a project I said. But DDT is a pesticide, right? Kills insects. And it was used very widely in the 1930s through 1950s or early 60s. And it was used in agriculture to kill insects that were feeding on crops. The problem is DDT, as it got into the environment, had serious negative effects on various species. Okay? It was spread on fields, and it would be taken up by plants, small animals, and then those plants were eaten by, first herbivores, and they were eaten by carnivores, and they were eaten by carnivores. But each step up the food chain, these pollutants, these toxins became more and more concentrated. And that's called biomagnification. And it led to serious problems with predators in the food chain, especially birds. The bald eagle in the United States was almost extinct because of DDT. When DDT got into bald eagles and other top carnivore birds, it led to their shells of their eggs being very, very thin. And they would often crack before the eggs would hatch. And so their reproduction rates went way, way down, and they almost became extinct. We banned DDT, I think, in the 1960s and 70s, and did not allow it to be used. Since then, these species have recovered significantly. That bald eagles are no longer endangered. So one way humans can cause extinction is by toxins, pollutants being released into the environment. Another is in how we use land, right? Because as human population growth has increased, we require more land for living space. We require more land for agriculture to grow food to support this growing population. And so as humans use up more and more land, that land was once the habitat of various species. For example, in China, the bamboo forests that have been decreased over time have led to the endangerment of pandas. There's less than 2,000 pandas in the wild. The destruction of the rainforest. Okay, we've seen in the last 150 years, 50% of the world's rainforests have been destroyed by humans. And as we talked about yesterday, rainforests are an extremely diverse habitat where you have many different types of living species using those habitats. So if that habitat gets reduced, that leads to endangering of all those species that are living there. We also know that as humans continue changing the Earth's climate, that alters conditions so that some species are no longer well adapted to those conditions. A classic example to think about is polar bears, right? If you think about the warming of the Earth and the loss of that tundra habitat that polar bears live on, as that space reduces, then the area where these polar bears can survive decreases as well. They're not adapted to living in conditions that are warmer than that. And so climate change can lead to serious endangerment of lots of different species. Connecting again to yesterday, as we lose species, we are reducing biodiversity. And we know that a more diverse ecosystem is more stable. We know that there are also valuable medicines and compounds that can be found in these ecosystems. We talked about medicines which can be found in plants of the rainforest. And if we destroy those habitats, then who knows what sorts of useful organisms are being destroyed. So how do we do anything about this? Right? This is a major problem. Well, some ways that humans try to reduce this is creating protected areas of habitat, parks, refuges, areas where logging is not allowed. Those sorts of things can protect the habitat of species, and they can be specific to certain species. If there is an endangered species that lives in a certain specific ecosystem, that ecosystem can be protected through laws and regulations, helping to reduce the chances of it becoming extinct. Reducing pollution by more sustainable agriculture practices can reduce these issues we talked about regarding pesticides. We have laws. There's the Endangered Species Act that was passed in the United States, which protects endangered species. If you want to do some kind of development and there's an endangered species that uses that area as habitat, then you can't build that development. You need to take into account these endangered species and how to protect them. And we can address climate change. If we address climate change, then we can try to reduce the threatening of species due to these changes in climate. Here are some examples of species that are endangered. Okay. Now, these are all large organisms that we can easily recognize, Asian and African elephants and tigers, giant pandas, blue whale, the gorilla, red wolf. But for all these species that are like cute and big and we pay a lot of attention to, there are thousands and thousands of endangered species that we don't really pay attention to. Little amphibians or plants or small reptiles, things that are not as obvious to us, but are still threatened and endangered. One other way that species can become endangered is through the introduction of what we call invasive species. Invasive species are when a species is brought from one part of the world to another part of the world where it's not native, where it didn't originally evolve and adapt. And that presents some serious problems. When species are transported from one area to another, often when they get to a new ecosystem, they don't have predators, right? Nothing that lives there had evolved to eat those species. And therefore, they sort of can grow unchecked. The population can grow very quickly. And therefore, they can overwhelm an ecosystem. They can outcompete the native plants and animals that did live in those areas. Sometimes they're called exotic species or imported species or foreign species. And there's lots of examples of this. Some examples on the bottom, this is a picture of kudzu. It's a plant. It was an Asian plant that was introduced to North America, and it grows absolutely out of control. In a single year, you could see in the winter when it's died off, this is a little cabin in the woods. This plant grows and is basically draped over and covering this entire forest. Okay, it grows out of control. You see this in the south. If you're driving down south, you can see it on power lines and just growing out of control. If you have like an abandoned car, it'll cover the entire car in a single season, because there's nothing that really eats it. In our area, I used to do a project like 10 years ago. You know what cattails are, right? Cattails are growing like a marsh. They got that brown, looks like a hot dog on it. Those are native marsh vegetations to us. And reeds and purple loosestrife is a plant that was introduced from Europe into the United States, and it basically is taking over marshes. Like if you are going to North Utica, if you go to like Walmart, BJ's in that area, you go on the highway and you're driving over the Utica Marsh. If you look at that in the summer and it's all purple with flowers, that's purple loosestrife. It's a plant. People brought it to the United States for like a landscaping and ornamental, and it's escaped and gotten completely out of control. And it's actually outcompeting cattails, which are the native type of vegetation in those areas. So the number of cattails have been decreasing. And lots of species use those cattails for food, for shelter. And so those species are then threatened as that happens. Some other interesting facts. Rabbits in Australia. In 1859, 24 rabbits were brought to Australia for hunting. And they were introduced there on purpose. Now, today, they're a huge problem in Australia. There are billions of rabbits in Australia that were non-native. And again, because they didn't have native predators, their population could just grow out of control. This is a snakehead fish. You can find that around here in North America. The lampreys I showed you. There's lampreys that were introduced here from Asia. The rat was introduced to North America from Europe. All of these different examples are invasive species that were either purposely or accidentally introduced to an ecosystem and have become major problems. Oh, one more example. Do you know what a starling is? A little black bird with a yellow beak. You can see them all over here. They live in little flocks. You can see them. They were brought here to North America from Europe. Somebody brought a dozen starlings from Europe to Central Park in New York City because they wanted to have the birds that Shakespeare wrote about in his plays. And that's where they came from. They now are distributed all throughout North America. There are billions and billions of starlings that have grown from that small group of introduced species. So these species can just grow out of control. One way, I'll show you, that we can try to control these is by finding a predator of them and then introducing their predator to the ecosystem. That's what I used to do in this project. I used to raise these beetles with my class that preyed on this purple loosestrife plant, and we would bring them to the Utica Marsh and release them, and in hopes of this beetle population establishing and controlling some of that purple loosestrife. Here are other. Do you know what zebra mussels are? These are zebra mussels. They're little tiny mollusks. They were introduced from Asia in the water that ships carry. They have spread all over the North America. They're a major problem. They cut your feet when you step on them. They've outcompeted native mussels. They clog up pipes and things. This is what purple loosestrife looks like that you find in marshes. Another similar kind of plant that grows in marshes are Phragmites, this reed. You see this all over. If you look in any wet area around our area, probably you'll see a lot of this. That's a non-native plant that's outcompeting cattails. Gypsy moths, Dutch elm disease, and so forth. These are insects that were introduced to North America that can have serious impacts on forests. rats, starlings, like I said, pigeons, all introduced species. And if anyone does anyone go camping like regularly? If you go camping, maybe those of you that go, you might know this. Like you're not supposed to bring firewood from one area to another. Have you ever heard of that? Like you're supposed to get your firewood locally when you're at a campsite. And that's because oftentimes when people bring firewood from, 200 or 300 miles away, with it, they could be bringing diseases and insects and introducing them into these other areas. So that's one of the reasons why that's a rule when you go camping some of these places. All right, we'll call things there for now with our discussion of invasive species. Anybody have any questions about any of these?